download our Revise It Right revision app for hundreds of videos, quizzes, exam questions, tutor support and so much more. This video is about vaccination. Now, vaccinations have really changed how we fight various infections. Now, once you're infected with a pathogen, three things can happen, and we learnt about this in the last video. The pathogen can engulf, the white blood cells, can engulf the pathogen, or it can produce antitoxins, or, and more importantly today, can produce antibodies. Now, the problem is with this can take some time. And in the meantime of while we're trying to fight this disease, we could get pretty ill. And in some cases, we could even die from the disease before our body has a chance to protect ourselves from it. And this is where vaccinations come in real handy. So a vaccination, what a vaccination actually is a smaller or weaker, so a small or weak version of the pathogen. So for example, our MMR vaccination, which is measles, mumps and rubella, contains a weak version of measles, mumps and rubella. Now these are injected into our individual, okay, so if you draw an arm here, they are injected into the individual. Now these weaker version of the pathogen still contain the antigen for the measles, the antigen for mumps and the antigen for rubella. Now that's very, very important, because then our white blood cells can come along and they can produce antibodies for these antigens. And these antibodies can then destroy the weak version of the pathogen. Now why this is really useful is because the weak or the dead version of the pathogen is not enough to make you ill, and it's not a deadly dose. So your white blood cells have time to produce the antibody, and you're not going to suffer any illness or potentially die from the dose. Okay, now you'll remember from last video that I said once you've already produced the antibodies for this pathogen, if you were to then go and get measles, so you were to get infected with measles, your white blood cells would already know how to produce these antibodies, so they produce them very, very quickly to be able to destroy the measles before it could make you ill. And that's why vaccinations are very, very, very useful. So measles in the future will be very quickly recognised and very quickly attacked, and therefore you can't get ill. So just to very, very quickly summarise that, a vaccine is about inserting a small or weak version of a pathogen. Your white blood cells and your lymphocytes can produce antibodies very, very quickly. Initially they'll produce antibodies to attach to the antigen on this measles, mumps and rubella pathogens that are in the vaccine. Then if you were to go and get infected by measles in the future, your white blood cells would know how to produce the antibodies much, much quicker. They'd bind to the antigen and be able to destroy them really, really quickly, which means you won't be infected by measles the second time you get it. Remember to download our Revise It Right revision app, watch over 700 videos, answer 4,000 plus quiz questions, over 1,000 flashcards, 1,000 exam questions, worksheets, forums, and get help from qualified teachers and so much more. The link is in the description. Now, as with everything in biology, it seems there are some advantages and some disadvantages to using vaccinations. So we're going to talk about them now. So an advantage, one big advantage, is that we've been able to use them to control lots of communicable diseases in the past. And I keep using the example of measles, and that is because now measles just is not as prevalent as it used to be before the vaccine came along. Now there's loads of examples of where vaccines have become really, really important. Polio, whooping cough, rubella, mumps, tetanus, smallpox, lots and lots of different types of communicable disease that has been controlled due to a vaccine. And it then also on that can prevent big breakouts of disease, i.e. epidemics. Okay, so if we can produce a vaccine quickly, then we can prevent a real epidemic. And so a large amount of the population can be vaccinated. So this leads to something called herd immunity. Now what we mean by herd immunity is that lots of a population are immune. Now why that's so important is because more people are immune to the disease, then there are less people that can catch it and spread it to other people. So if 80% of a population was immune to a disease, then that would be far fewer people that could spread the disease, and therefore it'd more likely die out for the rest of the population because it's less likely to spread. So herd immunity is the idea that lots of a population are immune to a particular disease. Now some disadvantages are that number one, vaccines don't always work. And by that we mean that they don't always lead to immunity. And sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes you can have a bad reaction to a vaccine. They can cause various side effects. But as I just said, these bad reactions are very rare. So now we've gone through that, have a go at answering these questions, and we will go through the answers afterwards. So pause the video now. Okay, so question 1, what is an antigen? Well, this is we've briefly talked about in this video, but we talked about in the last video. So it's a marker on the surface of cells. And importantly, it's a unique marker. It's a unique protein marker. What is an antibody? Well, an antibody is a substance that attaches to the antigen of pathogens. And importantly, we have specific antibodies for specific pathogens. What cells produce antibodies are white blood cells. What happens the second time your body meets the same pathogen? This is the idea that the antibodies are produced much quicker. So then you can fight off the infection. Before getting ill. What actually is a vaccine? Well, remember, it's a weak or dead version of the pathogen. What is the advantage of vaccinations? Well, one huge advantage is that in the past we've used it to control lots of diseases. And remember, we also said that it can reduce the effects of big outbreaks, of big epidemics, and lead to herd immunity. What is herd immunity? Well, it's the idea that lots or most people within a population are immune to a disease. So most people within a population are immune to a certain disease. Roy is an anti-vaxxer. He doesn't want to give his child the vaccine for measles. Explain why Roy is endangering both his child's life and the life of his elderly neighbour. Right, so first of all, why he's endangering his child's life is because if his child is not immune to measles, then if the child were to catch measles, then it is a deadly virus and his body wouldn't know how to fight it quick enough, which could potentially lead to him dying from measles. He's therefore affecting his elderly neighbour, because if his kid were to bring home measles and go and see his neighbour or to be around his neighbour, then he can then pass that virus onto his neighbour. And again, his neighbour, who's elderly, would probably die from measles because he just would not be able to fight it quick enough. And finally, summarise the steps of a vaccination. Let's do that on this page here. Summarise the steps of vaccination. So step 1, we've got the idea that a dead or weak version of the pathogen is injected. Step 2, this causes the white blood cells to produce antibodies. Step 3, These antibodies attach to the antigen of the pathogens within the vaccine. Step 4, in the future, if the individual received the disease that the vaccine was fighting against, they would produce antibodies much quicker and therefore be able to fight that disease before it causes any harm. So we've now there looked at lots of different things. Really, we've looked at vaccination, the steps into how it works, and then the advantages and the disadvantages of vaccinations. You can now move on to testing yourself with the quiz and through our exam questions. And as always, if there's anything you didn't understand, then please, if you're a paying member, contact one of our tutors and they will happily help.